So now that we're in late November and 2024 is coming to a close, I wanted to go through the entire year and find out which fighter deserves Fighter of the Year the most. Now, I do believe the phrase Fighter of the Year is pretty self-explanatory, but I'll go ahead and give you my criteria for what I believe what the Fighter of the Year should be. And I'm not talking about a guy who's only fought once a year, who only has one good KO in 2024. This is a guy who I believe has fought numerous times this year, has won, has beat the best opponents this year as well, possibly a champion. Some on this list might not even be champions right now. They've just been that active. But overall, I want the Fighter of the Year to be the person who has made the biggest impact and has been the biggest help to the UFC and us fans so far in 2024. Now, I've gathered a list of only 5 fighters who I will rank according to who I believe should be Fighter of the Year. I'm not doing top 10 because top 10 I think is a little bit too far of a stretch. I don't think there are 10 clear-cut candidates who should be Fighter of the Year in 2024. I believe there's only really 5, and I think 5 might even be a stretch. But let's not waste any more time. Let's dive right into the top 5 candidates who I believe should be in contention for Fighter of the Year in 2024. Now, starting off with number 5, this one might be a little bit out of left field, but I do believe this guy does deserve to be in the conversation for Fighter of the Year, and he is a non-champion who just recently got ranked, so I am kind of going far with this one, but listen, it's Carlos Prates. Now, Carlos Prates has fought 4 times this year, has won 4 times this year. He's won every single fight by finish. I even think that this year he's had a better year than his teammate Kyle Baralho out of Fighting Nerds. I think he is obviously, clear cut the second best out of Fighting Nerds. Now, Kyle Baralho is already ranked in the top 5. He's been in the UFC for quite a bit longer because, of course, I believe Carlos Prates made his debut in the UFC this year in 2024. And he's already done so much, man. I would be lying to you to say that Carlos Prates is just some weird prospect. I think at this point, man, he's on his way to becoming a contender. He, again, is winning. He beat Neil Magny by finish. He beat Charles Radke by finish. He had a sick performance against Li Jing Liang where he won, again, by finish in the second round. Also beat Trevin Giles in his debut in the UFC. So it just seems like to me that Carlos Prates has been an absolute monster this year. And he's doing all of this while I think smoking like 12 cigarettes a day, like a pack of cigs a day. I mean, the dude is showing us that you can be addicted to nicotine and still find a way to, I guess, be good in the UFC. Now, obviously, we haven't seen his cardio tested out yet, so we haven't really seen the true effects of the pack of cigarettes a day from Carlos Prates. But eventually, I think when he does fight somebody up the rankings, we'll see that cardio be somewhat tested. Obviously, against Neil Magny, a guy who was trying to grapple him up, it took him a little bit of time to get that KO going. Eventually, he did find that KO in the last 10 seconds of the round. So obviously, I think a guy who will lean towards more grappling in the future, like a Sean Brady, will give Carlos Prates some more issues. We haven't really seen his grappling defense be truly tested by an elite grappler, so we'll see down the line most likely. But I think nevertheless, in terms of 2024 alone, this guy has had an amazing debut, an amazing rookie year in the UFC, and I think he does deserve to be in kind of the conversation for Fighter of the Year in 2024. Now, does he deserve it? In my opinion, no, because again, he hasn't fought anybody of really any true significance in the UFC so far. Again, his best win is Neil Magny, who has been the perennial top 15 gatekeeper of the UFC in the welterweight division. So obviously the name value for Carlos Prates is not there just yet, but in terms of just being active and fighting often and winning by KO, Carlos Prates has had an amazing year, and I won't take that away from him. But we move on to number 4 on this list, and I do have another non-champion on here, and that is Diego Lopes. Now, Diego Lopes, after the Evloev loss, after his UFC debut, he has been an absolute monster. And this year in 2024, he has 3 wins over Sadiq Youssef by first round KO, over Dan Ige on 4 hours notice, but that's a Dan Ige nevertheless, and Brian Ortega, which he could have finished him in the first round, but he woke up Ortega with his left hand after his right hand landed. So Obviously, he has beaten some top contenders. He beat a Brian Ortega coming off a win against Jair Rodriguez. He also beat Dan Ige, who's always been a good featherweight throughout his entire career. Obviously, not a top 5 guy, but always been a good top 15 guy at featherweight. And then, of course, like I mentioned before, Sadiq Youssef, who has been, again, another top 15 guy. A bit chinny, but, I think nevertheless, this has been a really great year for Diego Lopes. And again, some of these fights that he has, right? He could have pulled out against Dan Ige. He could have not fought Dan Ige on 4 hours' notice. It really was kind of not beneficial for him to ever take that matchup. He had no training camp for Dan Ige. Now, he had training camp in general. I forget who he was supposed to fight. No, it was Brian Ortega. Because if you do remember, he was supposed to fight Brian Ortega instead of Dan Ige, which I do think their styles are really quite different. So his training camp wasn't really focused around a power puncher like a Dan Ige is, and more so grappling centered around Brian Ortega, and a guy who is more so, I think, volume based than power based, and a little bit kind of unorthodox at times. So I think he was preparing for a completely different style versus Brian Ortega or versus Dan Ige, and I think it was really tough on him to really fight Dan, who I think, honestly, if I'm being real with you, I think Dan Ige is probably one of the worst matchups stylistically for Diego Lopes in the UFC, a guy who is really good power, short, stocky, who can catch him with an overhand. Danny Ige is a tough matchup for Diego Lopes, and he won. Now, obviously, in that third round, I do think Danny Ige could have probably got him out of there if he really, pressed on the gas pedal, but he decided not to. But Diego Lopes still ended up winning that fight, and then he went on to fight Brian Ortega, which he won by unanimous decision. So, I mean, overall, 3 wins in 1 year, I think is very, very good. I think this is the kind of the standard for any UFC fighter who hasn't, been flatline KO'd. I think fighting 3 times a year should be the somewhat bare minimum. So he does clear that bar for me, but by the way he's winning and that he's also moving up the rankings at the same time, I think this year has been very, very impressive for Diego Lopes. And obviously he has one good win by finish this year, and he's been having really exciting fights for the most part. Danny Ige was a fun fight. Ortega was a fun fight. I think overall he's been a very fun fighter to watch, and he also has had one of the better years in 2024. I also forgot to mention he does corner some other fighters, so he kind of is working as a coach at the same time, which I do believe some of those fighters have won. So again, been a great year for Diego Lopes. Now, moving on to number 3 on this list, I do have my first champion, and that is Dricus Du Plessis. Now, I was contemplating putting Max Holloway on this list, but of course, he did lose to Ilia Topuria, so I had to find the next best guy who could fill in for this number 3 spot, and I thought it was Dricus Du Plessis. He has a win over Sean Strickland this year, who is, of course, a former champion, and a win over Adesanya, who was getting top GOAT, middleweight GOAT sort of glaze this year and was on his comeback, who had time off. People were really giving Dricus a hard time about beating Adesanya, and many people thought that he wouldn't beat Adesanya based on his style, and he proved some people wrong in a really fun fight. And I don't care what anybody says, I think the Strickland fight and the Adesanya fight are both really good fights to watch. I think Dricus beating both of those guys this year has been very, very impressive for a guy who doesn't look like he's the most technical guy you've ever seen, but then again, his cardio, his pace is, I think, really unmatched. His physicality in the octagon, I think, is hard to deal with for some fighters. His relentless takedown threat is also pretty hard to deal with. And the funny thing about Dricus is the fact that he looks like he's gassing. He looks like he's tired all the time, but he's always able to still push the same pace and fight at the same pace quite consistently, and I really do rate him for that. I mean, taking those body shots from Adesanya in that matchup was, I think, really, really impressive from Dricus Du Plessis. I mean, it was, again, another great performance where he wins by 4th round submission. And he, again, of course, beating Sean Strickland by, arguably, it can go to Strickland. Personally, I did score that for Dricus Du Plessis, but that's pretty much the only thing you can kind of critique about Dricus this year. And if we're going based on paper, he did win both those matchups. He was scored the win for the Strickland fight, and he obviously did submit Adesanya, which is, at this point, as much as I dislike Adesanya, he is kind of a legend of the sport at this point, and he will be in the UFC Hall of Fame one day because he did have so many defenses and he did kind of clear out middleweight at one time. So I think in terms of champions, I think Dricus has had one of the better years. I mean, most other champions only fight once a year. Islam has only fought one time this year, but every single other champion is either newly crowned or they've only fought once this year. So I think in terms of the champions, I think Dricus does land himself in the third spot overall. And of course, when it comes to the champions, I do think he's third as well. So yeah, Dricus Du Plessis is third on my list for Fighter of the Year in 2024. Hopefully 2025 will be a better year for him. Hopefully he fights Chimaev. That would be a banger fight. And if he does win, that's even more legacy on top of Dricus. I predicted that Dricus wouldn't lose his belt until I think 4 or 5 years from now. So we'll see what happens. But I think Dricus has been a really good fighter this year and has been fun to watch, even with the narratives that have been pushed against him. But moving on up to number 2 on this list, I do have the current featherweight champion, Ilia Topuria. Now, Topuria has only fought twice this year, and just that itself wouldn't be too amazing, but it's who he beat this year. He beat the featherweight GOAT, in my opinion, in Alexander Volkanovski. You could argue Volk or Jose Aldo. My personal opinion, I do think it's Volk. And he also beat Max Holloway, who was having a crazy 2023-2024 run. And he seemed like he was almost unbeatable, having a highlight reel KO over Justin Gaethje, having a highlight reel KO over TKZ. It seemed like Holloway was entering the true prime of his career. He's been in the UFC for a very long time, but it seemed like now this was a different version of Holloway who actually showed some power. And for Topuria to go out there and pretty much smoke both guys by KO, I think has made him Fighter of the Year in 2024 worthy. Now, in my opinion, I do think the Volk win is a little bit less impressive than the Holloway win because Volk was just coming off a KO loss to Islam Makhachev 4 months before that. So I think his chin was already primed up, served up for Topuria in that matchup. So I think that win is a little bit less amazing to me. But the Holloway win, bro, I think is one of the best performances we've seen in UFC history. Honestly, Holloway was a different sort of gravy coming into this year and coming into that fight. And for him to go out there and KO Holloway. Max Holloway was a fighter who was never been KO'd before, let alone knocked down before in a UFC fight. I think he had one iffy one versus Gaethje, but I think there was no official knockdown ever scored for Holloway against him. I don't think Holloway was ever officially knocked down in a UFC fight. And Max Holloway was always known for having one of the best chins in the UFC, having an absolute granite chin. If I had to rank them before the Topuria fight, I would probably have Marvin Vettori at 1, Holloway at 2, and those chin, being there with Vettori is actually ridiculous. That man does not ever get hurt for some reason. But Holloway just seemed like he was unshinnable, that he was on this next technical level in terms of striking, and it felt like Topuria was in for a really, really grueling, tough fight where he might have gotten outstruck if that fight went 5 rounds. I mean, I even predicted that Topuria would win, but I thought he would win by, hurting Holloway in the first 3 rounds, but then losing the last 2. I forget which one I predicted, but again, 2 of the best wins you can have, I think, in UFC history currently right now, Topuria does have over Volk, over Holloway. It's been a crazy year for him. Hopefully, he stays active. That would be very important to me. I want to see more Topuria. He is on a McGregor-type level run. Obviously, not to the extent of McGregor because he's not selling 1 million pay-per-views, obviously. But the way he talks and the way he acts is McGregor-esque. He talks a lot of shit, and he backs it up so far. So I think Topuria is now a hot commodity in the UFC, and I want to see him continue that by staying active. Hopefully we see him in early 2025 or so against a new contender, but against Diego Lopes probably is what I want, honestly. But we'll see with Topuria. Obviously, 2 great wins this year, defending his belt against Holloway, KOs over guys who were thought to be un-KOable, if that's even a word. So, again, number 2 on my list goes to Ilia Topuria. Now, moving on to the grand finale, the number 1 fighter on my list who deserves to be the 2024 Fighter of the Year. It's pretty self-explanatory. If you have been watching the UFC this past year, you would have seen this guy on a lot of pay-per-views, main eventing them as well, saving some. Obviously, it is Alex Pereira. I think he thoroughly deserves it. The Jamal Hill one, UFC 300, one of the biggest pay-per-views of the entire UFC history, goes out there, smokes him in the first round by left hook, makes it look easy, has a TikTok, has a viral KO pretty much. Yuri Prohaska head kick KOs him out in the second round. And then obviously he fought Khalil Roundtree in an absolute banger of a fight. I mean, this guy has been pretty much there for the UFC. He's been the most clutch guy for the UFC so far in 2024 and parts of 2023. I mean, he has been that dude. Like, you really can't deny Pereira. He is 37 years old, putting on highlight reel KOs at the championship level, fighting often, being active, wanting to fight more. I think before this, he was unhealthy. I think he was hurt and injured, like fighting injured a lot of the time. And then he finally got healthy during his light heavyweight title run. And now he's looked better than ever. I mean, the Khalil Roundtree one is probably his most iffy performance, where he still won by round 4 KO, or he had a whole entire flow state to eventually pretty much batter Khalil Roundtree's face. I mean, it's pretty much undeniable that I think Pereira should be fighter of the year this year. Obviously, being a champion and what I mentioned before, he just is been that good. And if a fight does fall out for a UFC main event for a pay-per-view, he's probably the first guy to step in, which is one of the most I mean, probably one of the best qualities about Alex Pereira. He's going to continue to stay active. He's going to always be active. I think the only way he is not active is just because he's injured, because he just can't fight. Like, I think, or the UFC just holds him back and there's nobody else left for him to fight. It's going to take, I mean, something to really hold back Alex Pereira. And I think even if there is no more fighters at light heavyweight right now, he will just fight John Jones. He'll just fight Tom Aspinall. He'll find fights. He'll make sure he goes out of his way to get a fight done. It doesn't matter if there's no more contenders at light heavyweight. He's going to find a fight no matter what. And that is a unreplaceable fighter in the UFC right now, or irreplaceable fighter in the UFC right now, and that is Alex Pereira. There's not much more I can say about him. He is like the most self-explanatory guy who should be fighter of the year in 2024. It just makes sense. Like, you just can't deny Alex Pereira at this point, fighting 3 times, winning all by KO against good competition, against guys who are former champions. Like, I believe that most of his wins in the UFC are against former champions. Like, let's go through it. I mean, obviously here, Prohaska twice, former champion Jamal Hill, former champion Jan Blachowicz, former champion Adesanya, former champion Strickland, former champion. So the majority of his wins in the UFC are against fighters who have been formerly a UFC champion. And it's just ridiculous, man. He's having one of the best UFC careers so far. He's only been in the game for like 7 years? And to my knowledge, he's only been taking MMA like truly serious since September of 2021. Since he lost to Artem Vakitov, that's when he was like, okay, I'm going to really go all in on this MMA thing and see how far I can go in the UFC. And that was only, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 3 years ago to the date. So, I mean, this guy has been unbelievable this year in 2024 and throughout his UFC career. I think he is undeniable to be the 2024 fighter of the year. Alex Pereira at number 1 is the conclusion to my list. Now, if you enjoyed this video, maybe you disagree, maybe you agree, maybe you have another fighter who I missed out on who you think should be in the top 5 part of this list. So if you think any of those things, leave a comment in the comment section down below for me. I like reading your guys' comments, but like, subscribe, bell icon for notification, and I'll see y'all later. See you guys in the next one. Peace.